I believe she concluded her presence was not particularly valued.
The empty chair was the first thing he noticed. Not the absence of her voice, though the Whitmore drawing room without her voice was a different quality of silence than he had understood before that evening. Not the absence of her specific organizational presence, the way rooms worked differently when she was in them, the way conversations found their correct level, the way the specific social architecture of an evening held its shape. The chair. Her chair. The one at the left end of the second row in the Whitmore drawing room that she had occupied every Thursday evening for 14 months. The chair she always arrived at 12 minutes before the gathering formally began, having spoken to Mrs. Whitmore about the refreshment arrangement and having identified anyone who needed to be introduced to anyone else before the evening formally organized itself. Empty. He had noticed it in the first 30 seconds. He had told himself it meant nothing. He had spent the following 2 hours telling himself it meant nothing. At the end of the evening, putting on his coat, he heard Lord Ashmore say to his wife, "I noticed Clarissa Vane was absent tonight. Unusual. She is always here." His wife said, "I heard she has stopped attending the Thursday gatherings." Ashmore said, "Stopped? Why?" His wife said, in the specific tone of a woman who has information she has decided is sufficient to convey without elaboration, "I believe she concluded her presence was not particularly valued." He stood with his coat half on. Not particularly valued. He thought about the Pemberton dinner 6 weeks ago. He thought about Sir Richard asking who the young woman in the green dress was. He thought about his own voice saying, "Nobody particularly significant. A family connection of some kind." He thought about Clarissa 4 feet away. He thought about the empty chair. He finished putting on his coat. He said goodnight to the Whitmores. He went home. He sat in his study. He thought. Stay with me. Because this story is about what happens when a man who did not understand what he had begins to understand it through its absence. Welcome to Regent Hearts. Subscribe. Hit the bell. Now let us go back. She had come into his life through the specific sideways entrance of people who are genuinely useful in rooms where useful people are not common. His sister Eleanor's annual spring gathering. 3 years ago. He had been standing near the window trying to manage a conversation about hunting with a man he found tedious when he had heard, from the center of the room, a woman's voice saying something that produced a reaction in the 5 people around her that could only be described as a room waking up. He had turned. She was not the most beautiful woman in Eleanor's drawing room. She was not the most fashionably dressed. She was 22 years old in a pale yellow dress with the kind of direct attention in her eyes that made the people she was talking to understand they were actually being talked to rather than performed at. He had worked his way out of the hunting conversation over the following 15 minutes. He had been in her vicinity for the rest of the evening. She had talked about the Ashford land dispute that was in the papers with the specific informed engagement of someone who had read more than the social column version. She had talked about the Whitmore's garden renovation with the structural precision of someone who understood what the problem was. She had talked about her younger brother's situation at Cambridge with the specific warm humor of a person who loved someone clearly and was not going to be sentimental about it. He had listened. He had thought, this one. Not in the romantic sense. Or not only. In the sense that had been applied to every genuinely capable person he had encountered since he was old enough to understand the difference between people who were present and people who were performing presence. This one is real. He had seen her at every social occasion he could engineer his presence at over the following 3 years. He had not said any of the things that would have required him to acknowledge what that meant. He had introduced her to Sir Richard as nobody particularly significant. She had been in his social world for 3 years. The specific quality of her presence in that world was something he had been understanding in increments without allowing himself to reach the conclusion the increments were building toward. She organized things. Not formally. Not with announcement. But when the Whitmore Thursday gatherings had a conversational imbalance, when the men had colonized one side and the women the other and the evening was failing to cohere, it was Clarissa who moved through the room with the specific deliberate intention of someone who understood the problem and was going to fix it by talking to the right person and directing them toward the right conversation. When Lord Pemberton's dinner seating had produced a pairing that was clearly causing discomfort, she had spoken to Mrs. Pemberton at the interval, and by the third course the seating had rearranged with the specific naturalness of something that had always been correct. When young Arthur Whitmore had been publicly embarrassed at his sister's engagement dinner by a comment from Lord Cavendish that he had not been equipped to respond to, Clarissa had said something 3 sentences later that had redirected the entire table's attention, and by the end of the evening Arthur's position was completely intact. He had watched all of this. He had watched it with the specific focused attention he gave to things that interested him genuinely. He had not said anything. Not to her. Not to anyone. He had introduced her to Sir Richard as nobody particularly significant. The evening after that, at the Whitmore Thursday gathering, she had been present. In her chair. 12 minutes early as usual. Talking to Mrs. Whitmore about the refreshments. Directing Arthur Whitmore toward a conversation with the man from the Foreign Office that would be useful for Arthur and that she had identified within 10 minutes of the evening beginning. He had sat across the room and watched her work and thought, this one is extraordinary. He had still not said anything. And now the chair was empty. The following Thursday he arrived at the Whitmore gathering at the usual time. He looked at the chair first. Empty. He said nothing. He attended the gathering. He noticed, in the specific way he had not noticed before the previous week, the absence of the particular organizational intelligence she had been providing. The conversation on the east side of the room did not cohere. He watched Lord Pemberton attempt to manage the imbalance and produce a more awkward version of it. He watched young Arthur Whitmore in a conversation that was clearly not serving him, unable to locate the exit he had been provided for 3 months without knowing it was being provided. He watched the room and understood, for the first time with the specific clarity of absence, what presence had been doing. He went home. He did not sleep well. He wrote a letter the following morning. He rewrote it 4 times. He did not send any of the versions. The problem with each version was the same. They were all organized around explaining himself, around providing the context for the Pemberton dinner comment, around the specific circumstances, around the fact that he had been in conversation about something else and had answered automatically with the category he had been using publicly and that the category was not accurate. They were all, in their various forms, organized around managing the damage rather than admitting what had caused it. He threw the 4th version in the fire. He sat at his desk. He thought about what she had been doing for 14 months at the Whitmore Thursday gatherings. He made a list, because he was a man who processed things in writing. The list covered 3 pages. He read it twice. Nobody particularly significant. He looked at the 3 pages. He understood, with the specific clarity of someone who has made a list and been confronted by it, that the distance between the list and nobody particularly significant was not a minor inaccuracy. It was the specific opposite of accurate. She was the most significant person in every room she had been in for 14 months. She had been holding the social architecture of his entire Thursday evening social world together with the quiet invisible precision of someone whose capability was so complete that it had been mistaken for the natural state of things. The natural state of things was the empty chair and the incoherent room and Arthur Whitmore stranded in a conversation he could not navigate. Nobody particularly significant had been the difference between those 2 states. He went to find her. She was at home. Not hiding. Not performing the wounded withdrawal. Simply, at home. Reading. Doing the things she did when she was not attending Thursday gatherings in rooms where her presence was not particularly valued. She had expected this. Not him specifically. The understanding. She had known, with the specific honest precision she applied to all significant matters, that the absence would be legible in a way the presence had not been. That was partly the reason for the absence. Not entirely. The entirely reason was simpler and more personal and less strategic. She had stopped attending because attending had stopped being sustainable. Not because of Sir Richard. Sir Richard was the specific occasion but not the cause. The cause was 2 years of being present in his vicinity in rooms where she was increasingly certain of what she felt and increasingly uncertain that it was reciprocated in the way the evidence suggested it might be, and increasingly exhausted by the management of both certainties simultaneously. Nobody particularly significant had arrived in the middle of 18 months of that exhaustion. And she had looked at the chair and thought, not anymore. Not the Whitmore chair specifically. The specific chair she had been occupying in his social world. The position. The organizational intelligence deployed in rooms where it made things better for him and for everyone and where its source was invisible and unacknowledged. She had been holding things together for 2 years without being seen holding them. She had stopped. She was reading when he knocked. Her maid showed him to the sitting room. He was standing by the window when she came in. The specific posture of a man who has been standing by windows in rooms that contained her presence for 3 years and does not know how to be in the room otherwise. She looked at him. He looked at her. He said, the chair was empty. She said, yes. He said, the room did not work. She said, rooms require architecture. He said, I know that now. She said, what did you understand? He said, that the architecture had a source and the source had been invisible and I had contributed to the invisibility. She said, yes. He said, Sir Richard. She said, Sir Richard was the occasion. Not the cause. He said, what was the cause? She looked at him. She said, 2 years of being present in rooms where I was increasingly certain of something and had no reason to believe it was returned. And then being introduced as nobody particularly significant in a room where I had spent 40 minutes making things work before you arrived. The sitting room was very quiet. He said, I was in a conversation about something else and I answered with the category I had been using publicly for 2 years because I had not found the words for the other category. She said, what other category? He said, the accurate one. She said, tell me the accurate one. He looked at her. He said, the woman who redirected the Pemberton dinner at the interval and saved Arthur Whitmore at the engagement dinner and organized the Whitmore Thursday gatherings for 14 months without announcement or acknowledgement. The woman whose specific quality of attention makes every room she is in work better than it worked before she arrived. The woman I have been finding reasons to be in the same rooms as for 3 years because the rooms are better with her in them and I am better in the rooms with her in them. She said, those are the rooms. He said, yes. And also, not only the rooms. She said, say the not only. He said, the woman I have been trying to find the words for since the spring gathering at Eleanor's 3 years ago when you said something in the center of the room and I turned and thought, this one. The woman I introduced to Sir Richard as nobody particularly significant because nobody particularly significant was the category I had been using while I was constructing the correct words and the correct words were not yet ready and I gave him the placeholder and did not know you were 4 feet away. She said, I was at the Pemberton dinner for 40 minutes before you arrived. He said, I know. She said, I had already spoken to Mrs. Pemberton about the seating. He said, I know. I found out this week. I have been making a list. She said, a list. He said, of what nobody particularly significant has been doing for 14 months in the rooms I have been attending. The list is 3 pages. She looked at him. He said, I want to tell you what is on the list. Not because you do not know. Because I need to say it specifically and out loud and to you rather than in a study on paper. Because I have been a man who processed things in writing and did not say them and that specific quality produced Sir Richard and an empty chair and a Thursday gathering that did not work. She said, tell me the list. He told her. He stood by her sitting room window and told her every specific item on the 3-page list of what nobody particularly significant had been doing in his social world for 14 months. Every redirect. Every managed imbalance. Every Arthur Whitmore. Every Pemberton dinner. Every Whitmore Thursday. He did not perform the list. He did not manage it. He simply said it, specifically and directly, with the understanding of a man who has made the list and read it twice and knows what it means. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. She said, "That is a very specific list." He said, "I am a man who makes specific lists when I am trying to understand something important." She said, "And what did the list tell you?" He said, that the word nobody was the most inaccurate word I have applied to any situation in my adult life. And that I have spent 3 years being in your presence and constructing your absence into the category I was comfortable using while I was constructing the accurate category. And that the accurate category has been ready since the spring gathering at Eleanor's, and I have been revising it without cause for 3 years out of the specific cowardice of a man who understands what saying it requires. She said, "Say it." He said, "I love you." That is the accurate category. I have loved you since the center of Eleanor's drawing room 3 years ago when you said something that woke up everyone around you, and I turned and thought this one, and have been thinking it every Thursday evening for 14 months while sitting across a room from your organizational intelligence and calling you nobody particularly significant to the people who asked. The sitting room held the weight of this. She said, "I stopped attending because I was exhausted." He said, "I know." She said, "Not from the work. I like the work. From the management. From being present in rooms next to someone and being certain and uncertain simultaneously for 2 years." He said, "Yes." She said, "And then Sir Richard." He said, "Sir Richard was the occasion. I understand that. The cause was 2 years of me giving you the placeholder instead of the accurate category." She said, "Yes." He said, "I am not asking you to forgive the placeholder immediately. I am asking you to hear the accurate category and to tell me if it produces a response." She looked at him. She said, "It produces a response." He said, "Tell me." She said, "I have been certain of my own feelings for 18 months. I have been managing the uncertainty about yours with the same precision I manage everything. And I am considerably tired of managing it." He said, "Then stop managing it." She said, "You have to say the correct category in rooms." He said, "Yes. I will. Starting with the Whitmore Thursday gathering." She said, "That is insufficient. Starting with every room you have access to." He said, "Yes. Every room." She said, "And you will not introduce me as anything except what I am." He said, "What you are is the most significant person in any room you enter." "I intend to say that specifically." She said, "That is more than sufficient." He said, "May I come to the Whitmore Thursday gathering this week?" She said, "I will consider whether to attend." He said, "If you attend, I will be there." She said, "If I attend, you will sit beside me. Not across the room." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you will not speak to Arthur Whitmore about the Foreign Office connection until you have asked me who he should speak to first, because there is a sequencing to that conversation that you are going to miss if you approach it directly." He said, "I defer to your sequencing expertise." She said, "That is a significant change." He said, "I am making significant changes." The empty chair produced 3 pages of understanding. She looked at him. Something moved in her face. Not the managed expression she had been wearing since he arrived. Something underneath it. The specific expression of a woman who has been carrying a significant feeling carefully for 18 months and has been given permission to set it down. She said, "Sit down." He sat. She sat across from him. She said, "Tell me what else is on the list." He told her. All of it. They sat in her sitting room for 2 hours while he told her the complete 3-page list, and she listened and occasionally corrected his attribution. That was actually the sequencing issue, not the content issue. That was actually about the Pemberton imbalance, not the Ashmore situation, and he revised his understanding in real time. By the end of the 2 hours the list was accurate. She said, "You are a quick study when you are actually trying to understand rather than already understand." He said, "I have been insufficiently trying to understand for 3 years." She said, "Yes. You have." He said, "I intend to remedy that." She said, "I know. You have been remedying it for 2 hours." He said, "Is that sufficient?" She said, "It is the beginning of sufficient." He said, "What comes after the beginning?" She said, "Thursday." He said, "You will attend." She said, "I will attend. You will arrive before me for once and you will tell Mrs. Whitmore yourself that the refreshment arrangement needs adjusting because the west table placement is producing a traffic problem at the entrance." He said, "How long has that been a problem?" She said, 11 Thursdays. He said, "You have been solving it." She said, "I have been arriving 12 minutes early and solving it without announcement." He said, "And now?" She said, "And now you are going to arrive 14 minutes early and solve it with announcement." He said, "I can do that." She said, "I know." He stood. He went to the door. He stopped. He turned. He said, "Clarissa." She said, "Yes." He said, "I am going to be in every room that you are in for the rest of my life if you will allow it. Not to attend the rooms. To be in them. With you. Understanding the architecture rather than using it." She said, "That is a more accurate category than nobody particularly significant." He said, "It is the most accurate thing I have ever said." She looked at him. The specific expression she had been managing for 18 months was simply present now. Not performed. Not managed. Real. She said, "Thursday." He said, "Thursday." He left. She stood in the sitting room for a long time after the door closed. Then she sat back down. She picked up the book she had been reading when he arrived. She had not read it in 2 hours. She did not read it now either. She sat with the specific warm weight of something finally put down in the correct place. The Thursday gathering was in 4 days. She had things to do.
Before you go. Clarissa Vane spent 3 years being present in rooms where she was called nobody particularly significant. She organized those rooms. She held their architecture together. She made conversations cohere and imbalances resolve, and Arthur Whitmore navigate situations he could not navigate alone. And she stopped. Not dramatically. Not with an announcement. She simply removed her chair from the room and let the room show what it was without her. And the room showed exactly what it was. That is not a small lesson. It is the whole lesson. The people who hold things together quietly are not nobody. They are the architecture. And when the architecture leaves, the building shows you the truth. Subscribe to Regent Hearts. Share this today. Tell me in the comments which moment stayed with you. The empty chair. The 3-page list. 11 Thursdays. The accurate category. Arthur Whitmore. Or Thursday, arrive 14 minutes early and solve it with announcement. I read every single one. See you in the next story.